She looked at his hands first. That was where the judgment started. Not his face, not his clothes, but the grease lines worked into his knuckles, the kind that no amount of scrubbing had fully taken out. She registered them in less than a second, the way you register something that doesn't fit the frame you've already built. And then her eyes moved to his jacket, a canvas work coat, washed to a pale olive, and then to the small girl beside him, 7 years old, and wearing denim overalls with a smudge of something on the left knee that could have been rust or chocolate, and was probably both. His name was Graham Selby, and the aircraft they were walking toward was his. Not his alone. He held a fractional share through the Boundary Ridge Flying Club, a group of 3 small business owners who'd pooled together a King Air 2 years back, the other 2 being a veterinarian from Napanee and a retired school principal from the township just east of Millbrook. The tail number N4 Selby was on the club registration in his name. He had departed from the Boundary Ridge private terminal 16 times in the past 2.5 years without any particular difficulty. This was his 17th. Graham was 38, and he had the build of someone who had done both kinds of work. The kind where you sat at a desk for 12 hours drawing load distribution models, and the kind where you got underneath something and stayed there until you understood what was wrong with it. For 9 years, he had been a senior chassis engineer at a major automotive manufacturer outside Windsor, the kind of engineer who could read a stress fracture in a component the way other people read a sentence, automatically and at full comprehension. Then Carolyn died. 4 years ago, this past February, pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks between diagnosis and the end. He had taken his daughter and left Windsor for Millbrook, a town small enough that the hardware store owner remembered your name by your second visit. He opened a garage, not because he needed the money, not entirely. The consulting work he still did for Northgate Motors, a Canadian EV startup whose battery housing design relied on proprietary work he'd developed, covered the margins his garage didn't. He opened it because in the first year, without Carolyn, working on something with his hands and calling it fixed at the end of a day was the only way time moved at a pace he could manage. The garage was called Selby's, hand-lettered sign on the corner of Route 9 and Birch, the letters slightly uneven because Nell had helped paint it when she was 4 and he'd never fixed them. Carolyn would have liked them that way. Nell was walking beside him now, her hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers, her other arm swinging an insulated lunchbox shaped like a red toolbox. She had Carolyn's dark eyes and her own stubbornness and a habit of asking the exact question you weren't ready to answer. She was currently making an argument about turboprop engines that was mostly correct and would be entirely correct by the time she was 9. "Is that one ours?" she said, looking through the terminal window at the King Air idling on the apron. "That's the one. The propellers are already spinning. Turboprops, slightly different from propellers." "How different?" "I'll explain on the way." "Explain now," he explained. By the time they reached the gate corridor, she had the basic principle, which was all she needed for now. She was the kind of kid who preferred the skeleton of a thing first and added the rest herself. There was a woman standing at the entrance to the gate. She wore a dark blazer, a pale blouse, her hair pulled back at the nape of her neck. She held a tablet and a clipboard, the kind of clipboard that signals evaluation. She was, Graham would learn later, 34 years old. Her name was Portia Wyndham, and she was the owner of Wyndham Charter Services. The company contracted for ground handling at Boundary Ridge Aviation Terminal. She was there that morning conducting what she called a service review. She did them periodically, walked through her own operations without announcing herself, looking for the gap between what her staff reported and what was actually happening. She had done it 4 times in the past 2 years with hotel properties her company serviced. The method worked. You showed up looking like you were supposed to be there, and you watched what happened when people didn't know they were being watched. She looked up when Graham and Nell approached. There was a pause. Barely half a second. Graham had spent enough years in enough engineering reviews and contract negotiations to read a pause at that speed. He watched her eyes move from the canvas coat to the work boots to Nell's overalls, and whatever calculation was running produced a result she began acting on before she'd finished forming it. "Can I help you?" she said, Her voice was neutral, trained. "We're boarding," Graham said, "N4 Selby. Boundary Ridge Flying Club, fractional share." She looked at her tablet. Her finger moved along the screen, then she looked at him again. "I have a Mr. Selby listed as the principal member." "That's me." A pause, slightly longer than the first. "I'll need to see identification." "Sure." He handed her his license. She studied it with the thoroughness of someone looking for a reason to remain uncertain. She glanced between the photo and his face twice, then handed it back. And the child. Nell was looking at the woman the way she looked at engines she didn't quite trust. Careful, patient, trying to understand what the problem was. "My daughter," Graham said. "She's on the club booking. If you need to verify, my contact is Dave Pressman, club administrator. I can give you his number." "That won't be necessary." She didn't move aside. They waited. Graham stood with Nell's hand in his and looked out at the ramp through the terminal window. A de-icing truck moved in the distance. The sky over Boundary Ridge was flat pewter, the particular Ontario winter gray that doesn't commit to anything and doesn't apologize. Nell pressed closer to his side. "Are we going?" she said quietly. "In a minute." "Is something wrong?" He looked down at her. "No." And because she would know if that wasn't fully the truth, she just needs to check something. They boarded. The King Air's interior was practical and tidy. 6 seats, a fold-out work table, the hum of the turboprops shifting as the crew ran through their checklist. Nell went straight to the right-side window seat, pressed her nose to the glass, and started narrating the ground equipment to herself in the running commentary she kept up whenever she found something worth cataloging. Graham stowed their bags, sat across from her, and looked back through the cabin. Portia Wyndham was speaking with her ground staff near the door. She had her back to him. Her posture had the particular stiffness of someone who had made a decision and was now looking for the structure to support it. He looked out his own window. He hadn't slept well. He'd been averaging bad sleep for 2 weeks, since the Northgate situation had gotten complicated. The licensing deal, formalizing his proprietary battery housing methodology into a $9 million agreement, was 9 months in the making, and now 4 weeks from either closing or falling apart. There was a board meeting in Ottawa on Thursday. That was where they were headed. He'd brought Nell because the school had a professional development day, and Mrs. Fenwick, from across the road, had a medical appointment she couldn't reschedule. Nell was already on to comparing the ice crystals on the window to the ones she'd seen at home last week, and finding them measurably different, which she had theories about. He heard Portia Wyndham's footsteps enter the main cabin. She stopped near Nell's row. She had her tablet in one hand, and the expression of someone who has decided a problem is solvable. "Excuse me," she said. Nell looked up from the window. "I need you to move to a rear seat for departure." Nell blinked. "Me?" "It's a cabin positioning requirement for aircraft of this class." Graham turned in his seat. "That's not a regulation," he said. Portia looked at him. "There is no Transport Canada rule requiring a child to vacate a window seat before departure on a private aircraft of this configuration." His voice was even. Not quiet, not loud, even. "What you said to my daughter isn't accurate. It's a Wyndham Internal Service Protocol 4. What is the actual reason?" He looked at her, not with anger, with the steady attention of someone who has done enough quality reviews to know when the stated justification isn't the real one. "If there's a legitimate safety concern, I'll hear it. Tell me what it is." Portia's jaw tightened. She looked at her tablet, then she looked at Nell, then she looked back at Graham. And in the silence that followed, he understood. He'd sat in enough boardrooms, enough negotiations, enough moments where someone was doing something they'd convinced themselves was reasonable but couldn't articulate out loud. He recognized the look of someone who had no real answer and knew it and was deciding how to proceed anyway. She was still deciding who he was. She hadn't finished yet. "I'll need to contact operations," she said. "Fine," Graham said. "My departure window is 7:15. You have." He checked the watch on his wrist, a plain-faced Timex that had belonged to his father. 23 minutes. She walked to the rear of the cabin. Nell was watching him over the top of her lunchbox. "Dad," she said, "why does she want me to move?" He was careful in moments like this about what he said to Nell. She was 7 and she was sharp, and she would carry whatever he gave her. She looked at us when we came in, he said, and she decided what she thought before she got to find out if she was right. Nell turned this over. Because of the overalls. Maybe partly. That's dumb. People do dumb things sometimes, he said. Even careful people. Are you mad? He thought about that honestly. A little, he said, but mad isn't what helps us right now, so I'm going to wait. She seemed to accept that. She went back to the window. The de-icing truck had stopped. A ground crew member was repositioning a set of wheel chocks. Normal morning sounds. The kind that meant the world outside was going about its Wednesday without knowing or caring about what was happening inside this particular aircraft. At 7:13, a woman walked through the terminal door and into the gate corridor, with the energy of someone who had been called away from something more important and intended to make this efficient. She was 51, 5'3", and had been Graham's business coordinator for 3 years, since the Northgate consulting work had grown complex enough to need managing. Her name was Beverly Holt. She shook hands with the 2 ground staff members, introduced herself to Portia Wyndham directly, and laid the club's registration documents on the fold-out table in under 45 seconds. Boundary Ridge Flying Club, fractional ownership agreement, she said, opening the folder to the first page. Registered member, Graham Selby. N4 Selby, current airworthiness, all documentation in order. She turned to the next page. Mr. Selby's occupation, licensed mechanic and owner of Selby's Auto and Small Repair, Millbrook, Ontario. Secondary occupation, engineering consultant, Northgate Motors Limited, currently in final stage of a licensing agreement valued at approximately $9 million. She closed the folder. Signed letter of intent, on file with Patricia Croft's office in Toronto. The cabin was very quiet. Portia Wyndham was not looking at the documents. She was looking at Graham, who was sitting in his seat in his canvas coat, watching all of this with the particular calm of someone who has never once needed anyone to arrive with a folder to know who he was. Her face had gone still, not the still of someone who is fine, the still of someone who has understood, all at once, that the version of events they'd been running for the past 40 minutes has been entirely, completely wrong. She had questioned him at the gate. She had tried to move his daughter from her seat, and she had done all of it in front of Nell, who had sat there with her lunchbox and her horse-related patients, and watched an adult behave in ways she was now going to have to think about. Are we clear? Beverly said. Yes, Portia said, very quietly, we are. Beverly gave Graham a look that communicated several things she would share with him at a more appropriate time, and left. The ground staff returned to their positions. Graham waited until the cabin was settled. Then he said, Mrs. Wyndham. She looked at him. I'm not going to make a scene. He kept his voice level. That's not what I want in front of Nell, and I don't think it helps. He paused. But I need one thing from you. She waited. I want you to tell her. He looked at Nell, who had put the lunchbox down and was watching with her careful, even eyes, that you made a mistake. Not to me, to her. He looked back at Portia. She's 7. She's going to spend a lot of years being looked at and measured by people who haven't taken the time to see her. I want her to hear from an adult today that that's wrong. Something moved across Portia Wyndham's face. It was complicated and unguarded and more than the situation required, which meant it was real. She turned to Nell. I'm sorry, she said. Her voice wasn't steady. I looked at you and your dad and I made up my mind before I even said hello. And that wasn't fair. I'm sorry I did that. Nell looked at her for a long moment, with the seriousness she brought to apologies she was actually thinking about. Okay, she said. And then, are the engines going to be louder when we go? Something shifted in Portia's expression. Not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. For a couple of minutes, she said. Then it evens out. Okay, Nell turned back to the window. What none of them knew was that a man named Terry Goodall, a cargo logistics dispatcher who'd been waiting in the terminal for a delayed freight manifest that never came, had been recording from near the gate entrance since approximately 7:04. He'd started because something felt off, and he wanted a record in case things escalated. The footage was 17 minutes long. He sent it to his wife first. She watched it twice and told him it needed to go up. He argued with her for most of the afternoon. He was not a person who wanted attention. His wife won, as she usually did about things that mattered. He uploaded it that evening with one line of caption. Man showed up this morning to board his own charter plane and spent 20 minutes being told he didn't belong there. His kid was with him. Make of it what you will. No hashtags, no call to share. It didn't need any of that. By midnight, 14 million views. By the time Terry woke at 6 the next morning, his phone had stopped being able to process notifications fast enough, and he sat on the edge of his bed in his socks and looked at the number for a long time without knowing what to do. 40 kilometers away, in the executive offices of Wyndham Charter Services, Portia Wyndham's director of communications had been awake since 1 in the morning with 3 monitors open, and the expression of someone who has watched a number climb until the climbing no longer registers as information. Portia was in her car when she got the call. She pulled over on the Queensway and listened. Then she said, "Cancel everything for tomorrow. I'll be in by 7. She was in by 6. The comment sections were, and Portia read enough of them to understand the shape, even if each individual one still landed. Full of people who had been looked past, who had been questioned at entrances, talked over in meetings, measured by what they were wearing at the wrong moment. They had found Graham in his canvas coat and recognized something true. Some of them, if they were being honest, found something in Portia too. Not sympathy yet, but recognition. But Portia was thinking about something else by then. She was thinking about the crew assignment. Her service reviews were unannounced and internally randomized. No one outside her executive team knew a review was coming until the morning it happened. The Boundary Ridge site had been flagged 3 weeks earlier than her normal process. Through a scheduling request she couldn't immediately trace to its origin. She had assumed it had come through the usual internal channel. It hadn't. She started looking. It took 2 days. What her operations team found was a scheduling coordinator named Drew Farrow, 4 years, with the company, who had for the past 14 months been receiving quarterly payments from an entity called Trident Advisory Partners. Trident's primary client, one level down in the corporate structure, was a private investment firm called Vo Capital Group. Vo Capital Group was operated by a man named Sterling Vo. Sterling Vo was 52 years old, based in Toronto, and had built a reputation over the past decade for acquiring positions in emerging technology companies at moments of negotiated vulnerability. 6 months earlier, he had attempted to acquire a stake in Northgate Motors. The board had told him they were not looking for additional capital partners at that stage. He had pushed back twice and been declined twice. He had then, according to a source within Northgate that Portia's assistant reached informally and off the record, suggested that the board might benefit from a credibility review of their existing consulting arrangements before any licensing agreements were finalized. Portia read that line 3 times. Someone had known Graham's departure window. Someone had known which aircraft he was using and which ground company was handling it. They had placed her at Boundary Ridge that morning, not randomly, not coincidentally. They had placed her there because she ran unannounced reviews, because she had a reputation for high standards, because she was the kind of person who, when confronted with a man in a canvas coat standing at a private aircraft gate, might not immediately extend the benefit of the doubt. They had been right. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and sat in her empty conference room for a long time. Nobody had told her to look at Graham Selby and decide in a second what he was. Nobody had manufactured the expression on her face, or put the words in her mouth, or made her try to relocate a child from a seat she had every right to occupy. Those had been entirely her own. Whatever scheme had placed Wyndham Charter Services in Graham's booking, none of it would have worked if she hadn't done exactly what she'd done. She had been the instrument. She had also been the choice. She sat with that until the sky outside went dark and the city lights came up and her coffee had been cold for an hour. Then she picked up her phone and found Graham Selby's number. She dialed before she'd finished deciding whether to. He picked up on the 3rd ring. His voice was the same as it had been in the aircraft, unhurried, not hostile. "Selby." This is Portia Wyndham, she said. I have two reasons for calling. The first is personal. The second is something you need to know about tonight. A pause. Go ahead. The personal part first. She had decided not to build toward it. She had spent too much of the past week building toward things. I want to say something to you that I couldn't properly say in a public statement. I am sorry for how I treated Nell. Not as a company position. As a person who looked at your daughter and decided she was an obstacle. She's a child who was sitting in a seat she had every right to be in, and I tried to take that from her, and I have thought about that every day since. Not in a reputation management way. In a real way. There was a longer pause this time. I hear you, he said, careful but not closed. The second thing, she said, and she told him everything. Drew Farrow, Trident Advisory Partners, Vo Capital, the early scheduling flag, the Northgate connection. She spoke for 9 minutes without interruption. When she stopped, the silence on his end lasted long enough that she began to form the first sentence of a follow-up, and then stopped herself. You're telling me this, he said, before your lawyers know you're doing it. Yes. Why? She thought about the answer she had arrived at slowly over 2 days. Because what was done to you and Nell is still in motion until someone stops it, she said, and you can't stop what you don't know is happening. And because, she paused, I was used to do it, even if I helped more than I should have. That means I have some part in making it right. Quiet on his end, the kind of quiet that is thinking rather than waiting. Can you send me the documentation? My assistant will have it to you by morning. Okay, a pause. Miss Wyndham, this is going to create problems for you. Vo has resources and a long memory. I know. Your company is already under significant pressure. I know that too. Another pause. Behind his voice, she could hear something distant, a door or a cabinet, or the sounds of someone small moving through a kitchen at the end of a day. I appreciate what you're doing, he said. I want you to know that. Thank you, she said. I'm not promising more than that. I don't know you well enough. That's fair, she said. I'm not asking for more than that. She hung up and set the phone on the conference table and noticed that her hands were not entirely still. Beverly Holt had the documents on Graham's kitchen table by 9 the next morning. His legal counsel, Patricia Croft, a commercial fraud lawyer in Toronto, who had been practicing for 22 years and who described things in the precise, bounded language of someone who did not waste words on things she wasn't certain of, reviewed the materials that afternoon and called Beverly to say that the chain between Vo and the scheduling manipulation was documentable and that the Northgate angle made it considerably more serious than a simple employment misconduct case. The RCMP's Commercial Crime Unit received the formal submission 3 weeks later, packaged in a binder that Patricia Croft's cover letter described as among the most clearly assembled documentation of coordinated commercial interference she had reviewed in recent memory. The Northgate Motors Board held an emergency session. 2 directors had already seen the video. A third had received communication from Vo's office suggesting the board reconsider its consulting arrangements before finalizing any agreements, which, read against what Portia's documentation revealed, looked considerably less like independent advice. The board voted to accelerate the licensing timeline. Sterling Vo was not the first person charged. These things rarely work from the top down on the first move. Drew Farrow cooperated with investigators under a formal arrangement. A senior associate at Trident Advisory Partners was arrested and charged in early January, wire fraud, conspiracy to interfere with a commercial licensing process. Vo's name appeared in the supporting documentation in language that the people involved understood to mean, "We know where this leads, and we're building toward it." Graham read the news on a Thursday morning in his garage, standing at the workbench with his coffee and his coveralls already on from a job that had come in early. He read the piece twice, set his phone face down, and went back to the alternator he'd been pulling. Nell came in after school and did her homework on the stool beside the tool chest, as she did on days that weren't after-school care days. She worked for a while without talking, which meant she was actually working. Then she said, "Dad, that lady from the airplane." He looked up from the workbench. "Yeah." "Do you think she's okay?" He thought about it. "I think she's working on it," he said. What does that mean? It means the same thing it means for most people, he said, that they're trying. Nell turned a page in her workbook and seemed to find that sufficient. Outside, Millbrook was doing what it did in February, quietly, without announcement. Snow on the rooftops, a gravel plow on Route 9. The ordinary sounds of a place that had been there before any of this started and would be there a long time after. The licensing agreement with Northgate Motors closed on a Wednesday in the last week of February. 8 people in a Toronto conference room, documents signed in 6 places, hands shaken, a bottle of wine opened that was good without being the kind of good that needed explaining. Graham flew back to Millbrook that evening and picked Nell up from Mrs. Fenwick's, and she asked if anything important had happened that day, and he said yes a little. She asked if they could get poutine. He said sure. They got poutine. The Selby Trades Foundation launched on a Saturday in early April at the Millbrook Community Center. Graham had chosen the community center deliberately, over the suggestions of 2 board members who'd raised the practical case for a hotel venue. Because the community center was where the foundation belonged, and he wasn't interested in renting a ballroom to launch something whose purpose was to reach people who'd spent their lives being told that ballrooms weren't for them. Beverly had kept the guest list to just over 100. It was the right size. The scholarship recipients were 11 people, 8 from apprenticeship programs across Ontario and Quebec, 3 from rural secondary schools identified through partnerships with vocational programs. They sat in the front rows with the careful attention of people who have been told something real is happening and are still deciding, quietly, how much to trust it. Graham recognized that look. He had worn it himself at 26. He spoke for about 15 minutes, no podium notes. He talked about what it meant to do work that other people looked past, not because the work wasn't skilled, not because it wasn't essential, but because the intelligence required to do it well wasn't always the kind that got named and celebrated in the places where names and celebrations happened. He talked about the biz, arriving somewhere and being measured in 2 seconds by what you were wearing, and how that 2-second measurement could close a door before you'd ever seen it. He talked about Carolyn briefly, not at length. He said she had been, without question, the most competent person he had ever known, and that the world had benefited from her existence in ways it had mostly not acknowledged. He said the foundation was for people like her. Then he paused and said, "And for her." Nobody in the room said anything. They didn't need to. He was almost at the end when Nell appeared at the side of the stage. She climbed the steps with the focused intention of someone who has a specific purpose and has determined that now is the moment. She crossed to where Graham was standing and looked up at him with the patient, unguarded gaze she used when she was asking something she'd been sitting with for a while. "Dad," she said. The microphone caught it. The room heard. "Yeah." "On the airplane. Why didn't you yell?" He looked at his daughter. She was wearing a blue dress over her overalls. The overalls had been her condition, the dress his compromise, and her braids had held up through most of the morning and were now reconsidering on the left side. She looked exactly like what she was, a 7-year-old who had a question she'd been carrying since October, and had decided tonight was when it got answered. "Because I was looking at you," he said. She waited. That wasn't quite enough. "I decided what I wanted you to see," he said. "I was angry. Angry is fast. It comes and goes and then it's over. I wanted to show you something that lasts past that." She thought about it the way she thought about everything worth understanding. What's the thing that lasts? He considered the answer he actually had, which was different from the answer that would have sounded better. "Knowing you didn't lose yourself," he said, "even when someone was trying to make you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the specific nod of a conclusion fully reached. "Okay," she said. She turned and walked back down the steps the same way she'd come, unhurried, already finished, and disappeared into the row where Beverly was sitting. The room was still for a beat. Then someone started clapping, and then everyone did. Portia Wyndham was in the 7th row. She had not announced she was coming. She had called Beverly 3 weeks before the event and asked, simply and without framing it as more than it was, whether her presence would cause a problem. Beverly had checked and called back within a day and said it wouldn't. She had dressed to be unremarkable. Dark gray, hair down. She sat close enough to see Graham's face clearly and far enough back that no one needed to notice her. When Nell walked onto the stage, she stopped thinking about being visible. She heard Graham say, "Knowing you didn't lose yourself, even when someone was trying to make you." She sat with that. She thought about the terminal, the 2 seconds, the canvas coat, the overalls, the grease lines in his knuckles, the verdict she had arrived at before she had said a single word to him. She had been placed there by someone who correctly predicted what she would do, and the prediction had been correct not because of anything Vos had done, but because of something she had not yet finished looking at in herself. She was still looking. She expected to be looking for a while. After the ceremony, she waited near the side exit, talking to a woman from one of the apprenticeship programs who had questions about work in the charter industry. Portia gave her a direct number, not the main Wyndham line. Graham found her eventually. He looked tired in the way she'd noticed each time. A sustained, deep-in tired that wasn't defeat, just the natural result of carrying a lot for a long time. "You came," he said. "I did. A pause. I should have told you ahead of time." "It's all right." They stood for a moment in the easy quiet of people who have been through something together, without having chosen to be together, which produces a kind of understanding that doesn't require explanation. "The part about your wife," Portia said. He looked at her. "She sounds like someone the world couldn't afford to lose that early," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "She had a terrible sense of direction," he said. "Got us lost in a parking garage we'd used 100 times and blamed the map every single time." He looked toward the far wall. "She also told me when the garage had 6 customers and no future that what I was building was real, that I should act like it was real instead of waiting for permission from someone else." He paused. "I don't know if I'd have any of this without that." Portia said nothing because there was nothing better than the silence. After a moment, he looked back at her. "Thank you for what you contributed to the foundation." She had asked Beverly to keep it anonymous in the program materials. Graham knew anyway because Beverly had told him, and he'd asked if he could acknowledge it privately. She'd said yes. "It was the right use of the money," she said. "Yeah," he said, and almost smiled. Nell materialized from somewhere to his left, carrying a plate with a substantial butter tart on it, with the air of someone who has secured a limited resource and is not apologizing for it. She looked at Portia, the same look she'd had on the aircraft, measuring, patient, arriving at a conclusion in her own time. "You're the lady from the plane," she said. Not an accusation, just a fact being organized. "I am," Portia said. "You said sorry." "I did." Nell appeared to run some internal calculation. "Are you better now at not doing that?" The question landed somewhere unexpected, not because it was complicated, but because it was exactly the right one. Not have you made it up to us, not have you suffered the right amount. Just, are you better now? "I'm trying to be," Portia said. "I think so, but it's going to take a while before I know for sure." Nell considered that then. "Okay." She looked at Graham. "Dad, I'm going to eat this over there." She held up the butter tart as explanation and disappeared back into the room. Graham watched the space she'd left for a moment. "She asked me," he said, "about 2 weeks after that morning, whether you were a bad person." Portia looked at him. "I told her you were a person who'd made a bad choice," he said, "that those aren't the same thing." He paused. She thought about it for about 30 seconds and then asked if we could get ice cream. "So I think it landed." Portia looked at the middle distance and felt something loosen in her chest that had been there so long she'd stopped noticing the weight of it. "Thank you," she said, "for telling her that." "It was true," he said. They stood together a few minutes more. The conversation moved into something quieter, the timeline of the case, the Foundation's first cycle, what the next months looked like for both of them. Not warm exactly, not yet, but honest. And honest was something, and something was where things started. When she left, Graham walked her to the main doors. At the top of the steps, she turned. "For what it's worth," she said, "the people in the front rows tonight, they were paying attention to every word." He looked at her. That kind of thing lands differently, she said, when the person saying it actually did the work. He held her gaze. Something in his expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a possibility he hadn't yet ruled out. I'll let you know how the first cycle goes, he said. She nodded once and went down the steps. Outside, April in Ontario had finally stopped being provisional. The air was cool without being cold, carrying something forward-facing in it, the particular quality of a season that has decided to mean it this time. The parking lot held a loose scattering of people in conversations that had run past their natural ending but hadn't found the door yet. The neighborhood beyond was ordinary and unremarkable and entirely indifferent to what had happened in the months that had led to this evening. Portia sat in her car for a moment before starting it. In her bag was a copy of the Foundation's program criteria picked up from the registration table. She intended to read it properly, not as a donor, but as someone trying to understand the framework. How you identified someone who'd been overlooked. How you built something that didn't just reproduce the same assumptions with new branding. She thought she might have something to offer there eventually. Imperfect ideas, ideas that would need revision, but real ones, built on something she understood now that she hadn't understood in November. That the person standing in front of you might be building something you cannot yet see, and the failure to see it belongs entirely to you. She started the car and pulled out into the April night. Sterling Vaux's trial was scheduled for the fall. His attorneys had filed 2 motions to dismiss. Both had been denied. Drew Farrow was cooperating with investigators under a formal arrangement. The Northgate licensing agreement was active and ahead of its early benchmarks. Back inside the community center, conversations that had not existed 2 hours ago were still going. A Millbrook apprentice talking shop with a Northgate engineer. A scholarship recipient from Sudbury, writing down a name that had been given to her by a woman in a dark gray blazer, who'd turned out to know the industry better than she'd looked. Graham found Nell at the refreshments table. She was standing beside the last butter tart on the tray with the focused attention of someone who has identified a scarce resource and is being responsible about it. "There's one left," she said. "I see that. We should take it for the drive." "That's reasonable," he said. She wrapped it in a napkin with the care she gave to things that deserved care. Then she took his hand, 2 fingers, the way she always did, and they walked toward the door together. Outside, the April night had cleared. Stars were visible over Millbrook, which didn't always happen in a town with streetlights, but happened tonight. Nell looked up. "Stars," she said. "Good night for it," Graham said. She studied them for a moment, with the same attention she brought to everything worth understanding. Then she looked at him. "Butter tart tomorrow, too?" He looked down at her, this particular, impossible kid, with her overalls and her unraveling braid and her serious dark eyes that missed very little and forgave more than she'd been taught to, and he felt something that didn't have a word, which was fine. Some things were better without one. "We'll see," he said. They walked to the car together, her hand in his, and the night held them the way good nights do. Without ceremony, without knowing what had happened in the months that had made this ordinary ending possible. Which was the only kind of ending that was ever really true.